Good day. My name is Gene Rice. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Fort Hays State University. And the lecture topic for today is Introduction to Ethical Inquiry. For most of you watching this lecture, this will be your first philosophy course. And so it's important that we review a little bit about what philosophy is and then be careful to go slowly in thinking about what ethics is and, importantly, what ethics is not. So let us begin. If you recall from previous lectures, philosophy we defined as the love of wisdom or the unbounded pursuit of a meaningful life through rational inquiry. And we noted that philosophers tackle all the big questions. What is a meaningful life? What ought we to do and how should we live? We also noted that philosophers generally break down various kinds of questions into three areas. The first of those three areas is the area of metaphysics, which deals with questions about what is ultimately real. Questions about, for example, whether God is ultimately real, whether subjective experiences of color or feeling exist outside of the mind or can be reducible to other brain states. The second general type of philosophy question are questions of knowledge. Those go by the fancy name of epistemology, but basically those are questions about how we know, how we can separate true things from false things. The third area is value theory, and this is where we're going to spend most of our time today. If we look at the category of value theory, we find that that also has many subcategorizations underneath it. For example, aesthetics, which is the study of artistic value or beauty. You may have heard the claim that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's an aesthetic claim, a claim about the existence or the generation of beauty. Also under the category of value theory, we find moral and ethical philosophy, which of course where we'll spend some time today. And also under this category you will find social and political philosophy, which are the study of normative and conceptual questions having to do with coercive institutions. Primarily government, but also families. Families are definitely coercive institutions where parents give value or set out values for their children. So within the category of value theory we find lots of interesting questions, and today we're going to look at what ethics is and, again, importantly, what ethics is not, because this is probably your first philosophy class. It's very easy to confuse what it is the heck you're supposed to be doing in a philosophy ethics class as opposed to some other classes that you may have taken which dealt in one way or another with ethical issues. So let's begin. The first definition I will give you is a definition of ethics, which is a simple and short definition which says that ethics is the study of human conduct. And when we talk about human conduct, we use that phrase to point out that there are lots of things which humans do which are not really the study of ethics, and these are things we do unconsciously or instinctively. Right now my stomach is digesting my lunch, but that is not an ethical concern because it's an instinctive behavior which I don't really control. So ethics has to do with those actions that people choose. And so when we study ethics, we're studying those kinds of behaviors or conduct. It's critically important here that we make a distinction between describing what people do with their free choices and evaluating them. If you get one thing out of this lecture today, it should be the difference between descriptive ethics and what we'll call philosophical or normative ethics. So let's look at that very briefly and then ferret out some of the interesting things which come from that. I'm going to put up here in a minute a chart that has a number of categories underneath the general description of ethics. The first we just mentioned, philosophical and descriptive ethics, and then under philosophical ethics there will be further distinctions that we'll talk about here, each of them fairly briefly. But I will return to this chart at the end so you get the full view one more time. But as we go along, we'll be looking just at each of these levels underneath each other. So the first level then is the distinction between philosophical and descriptive ethics. We've already described ethics as the study of human conduct. We can study human conduct, free rational choice, in more than one way. In fact, we can inquire into it in many different ways. On the one hand, we might look at what people actually do or have done in particular places and times and cultures. If we scientifically investigate ethical behaviors, what people believe and why, perhaps how they have developed, we are doing what is called descriptive ethics. You may have, or you may be, a sociology major, a psychology major, or an anthropology major, or you may have taken classes where you investigated anthropological evidence for primitive cultures' beliefs on marriage, for example. In descriptive ethics, the inquiries aim to identify what it is people have actually believed on some particular moral issue. It doesn't have to be in the past. You could do an investigation into modern Americans' beliefs on capital punishment. We will not be doing descriptive ethics, as interesting as it may be, in this class, at least primarily. What we will be doing is what is called philosophical ethics. So if you go to the other side of that division, philosophical ethics is the open-ended, rational investigation into particular ethical beliefs, practices, or moral theories, and whether those beliefs, practices, moral theories, and values should be accepted. So this is the critical distinction for the lecture. It's not that we're not interested in philosophy in what people believe or have believed. That may come into play, and it may be important in certain respects. But for philosophers, the most important question is not what people believe, but whether they should believe it. Right? So it may be true that 100 years ago, most people believed that women were inferior to men. And it's a good thing that we investigated philosophically whether that should be the case, because of course now we think that that's wrong, that women are not inferior to men. And so in a philosophical ethics class, it's never enough for you to say, this is what I believe, or this is what person X believes. What is important is why they believe it, philosophically, whether we should believe it. And so in this kind of a class, you're going to be challenged again and again, and hopefully all of you will be challenged to think not only what you believe ethically, but why you believe it. Okay, let's advance here and take some examples of the difference between philosophical ethics and descriptive ethics. The first example up there is what do the Inuit people believe about infanticide? So we might do a scientific investigation. And in fact, the Inuit, you may know them as Eskimo people, did practice infanticide for a number of reasons, and that practice was fairly widely accepted. That's a descriptive question. The philosophical or the ethical question which we're most interested in is, ought we allow infanticide? That is it ethically okay for a family or a family member to kill a young child in certain circumstances? Another example might be the case of women's rights. So take a country like Saudi Arabia. What do the people in Saudi Arabia think about women's rights? Are rights embedded in the current law in Saudi Arabia? That would be a descriptive investigation into their ethical beliefs. But in philosophy, we ask the should question, and I've highlighted those there on the chart there in red to remind you that when we're doing philosophy, we're not asking the question what is the case, but what ought to be the case or what should be the case. So in this example, should women in Saudi Arabia enjoy the same rights as women in the United States? Or another interesting ethical question is, what is a human right at all? Are they universally valid or not? Good. So the third example I have down there has to do with modern Americans' beliefs on homosexual marriage. Currently in the United States, of course, there's a great debate about this. And so we might investigate a descriptive analysis of what people believe about it and why they believe certain things. But again, for philosophers, the interesting question is not what people believe, but should they believe it? And so we are doing philosophical ethics when we ask the question, should we allow homosexual marriage? Should governments be involved in regulating marriages at all? All right, so those are three examples which hopefully will help you distinguish a class that's aimed towards descriptive ethics versus a class like this one, which is aimed at prescriptive ethical thinking. All right, let's look at the next level, which is underneath philosophical ethics. So we're going to leave descriptive ethics behind and look then at the rest of the ethics tree there and investigate what philosophical ethics might contain. And as you're seeing there on this screen now, I've broken it down into two areas. The first is what we might call substantive ethics. This is the search for the basic principles, the founding ideas of right and wrong or good and bad. And the second breakdown there is what is called metaethics. In metaethics, we investigate certain important questions which affect ethical inquiry as a whole. And the relationship between these two is not always clear, that is between substantive ethics and metaethics. But I think it is helpful to separate out metaethical questions as an important subcategory of philosophical ethics. A good example of a metaphysical question, metaethical question, is the question of, are people free at all? So suppose we believe that that people are not free, that they're literally determined by prior brain states. Well, then that's going to obviously affect what we think about substantive ethical questions. Another great metaethical question has to do with cultural relativism. Are there such things as universally valid moral principles, or is morality relative to one's culture? And so that's a great metaethical question. It's unlikely that you will be dealing with a lot of metaethical questions directly in your class, although they will arise from time to time, and you may spend some time early on in your class thinking about, for example, ethical relativism. All right, so let's go a little further down the ethical tree and look at the division between ethical theory and applied ethics. So under substantive ethics, that is the search for the foundational principles of right and wrong, good or bad, we have a further division, and that's between primarily looking at or identifying, comparing, evaluating general models of ethical decision making, and so that would be ethical theory. And on the other hand, applying those models to particular problems or in particular areas of inquiry. So if you're in a general ethics course in Fort Hays State, our introductory to philosophy or to ethics classes, Philosophy 340, you will be doing a little bit of both. You'll be looking a little bit at the theories that Westerners have advanced in ethical theorizing, and you're looking a little bit at applied, that is, you'll take those theories and apply them to particular issues. If you're watching this lecture as a part of IDS 400 Bioethics or IDS 401 Ethics in the Professions and Business, you're going to get a little bit of theory, but you're probably also going to spend more time on the applied issues. That is, you'll take some of the theories and apply them to particular issues in your discipline or in business or in the professions. And you'll also spend comparatively more time looking at what are some of the ethical dilemmas which arise in business or in bioethics, as opposed to spending all of your time on theory. So nonetheless, I think that's a helpful distinction to keep in mind as you go through the course, whether you're doing ethical theory at any particular moment or whether you're looking more directly at applying a theory or an approach to a particular problem. All right, so that fills out then our ethics chart, which we'll put up there again for you. And remember, the most important distinction to recall, especially early on as you're getting your feet underneath you and trying to figure out what the course is about, is this distinction between philosophical ethics and descriptive ethics. And again, we'll be spending the majority, the lion's share of our time on philosophical ethics. Before we wind things up here, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking further on some of the things which are often confused with philosophical ethics. That is, some of the areas of inquiry or investigations which students often think that they ought to be employing in a philosophy class, but which really are not philosophical approaches to ethics. We've already looked at one of those. The first commonly mistaken area of inquiry for philosophical ethics would be descriptive ethics. And so I've already suggested to you that although anthropology and sociology and psychology are interesting disciplines and have lots of descriptive facts to share with us about what people believe, it is not the same as philosophical ethics. I also would like to spend a little time here thinking about how philosophical ethics is not like positive law. It's often the case that when we engage in ethical thinking or when we're in a dispute with another person about ethics, someone will bring in the case of what law is. And so I'd like to write on the board here a little bit about what the differences might or may not be here in the case of law. So let's think about philosophical ethics and what I'm calling positive law. As we saw in descriptive ethics, we may be interested in what the laws at a particular time are. So let's say now we have law against slavery. But in philosophy, we're interested in the ought question or the should question. Now, in the case here at present that we have a law against slavery, not many people are going to say we should not have such a law. But of course, if you go back in time long enough, we had a law that allowed slavery, indeed promoted slavery. And of course, we look back on that and we say, boy, that was a bad law. We should not have a law that promoted slavery. So positive laws are important, and it's certainly the case that when we decide what we ought or should do, that if this is important enough that we ought to inscribe it in our positive existing laws. But simply because we have an existing law does not mean that the philosophical debate is over. In fact, it means very little, to be honest, what the current laws are. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on in this lecture and then even on in the rest of your course. But there are lots of cases like slavery where we had existing laws on the books which we then changed. And the reason we changed them is because we thought the reasons for them were not good ones and that we ought to change them. And so when we think about philosophical ethics, it's all right to mention law, but that won't end the debate. In other words, if we're having a debate about abortion or about environmental ethics, and someone says, well, the law says abortion is okay, or the environment should be protected, that the existence of that law alone is not enough to end the debate. In other words, we should still, if we're being philosophers, we should still investigate further into the nature or the reasons for believing in any sort of thing. So let's put a big knot up here, because philosophical ethics is not the same as positive law, even though, of course, positive law is fine and interesting in its own right. Philosophical ethics is also not what we'll call moralism. Moralism is attempting to get you to behave according to some prescribed set of rules, some prescribed set of moral rules. Now, this is not to say that moralism, again, in and of itself is bad, but it does have a different goal than philosophical ethics. In the moralist view, they already know what is right or wrong. So, for example, Jesus Christ was not a particularly philosophical ethicist. That is, he was not interested in debating whether the golden rule was right or wrong. He was interested in convincing people the value of accepting the golden rule and abiding by it. So philosophical ethics is much more open-ended. We're more likely to consider whether or not any particular moral approach is good or bad, right or wrong, and compare it to other moral approaches to see which one stands the test of reason. The moralist is more interested than in getting you to accept his or her own view of what morality entails. And again, that may be fine in its own right. It's just that it's not philosophical ethics. So when we think about what it is this class is aiming for, it is, of course, in a certain sense, aiming to make you better ethically, but not just because or not because we know what's absolutely right or wrong, because in philosophy, all the questions are open and all the approaches are at least going to be given some consideration. All right. Another common misconception or a common difficulty in studying philosophical ethics is confusing religious and philosophical ethics. Of course, if you look at human history, both in the East and the West, many millions, probably many billions of people, including many millions in the United States and in China, have taken their ethical views from a religion, whether it be Christianity or Taoism. The relationship between religious ethics and philosophical ethics is often a confused one, and we're not going to be able to consider all of its possible relations here today. But I did want to, at least in this initial lecture, point out to you that religion will accept some ethical values or some principles on foundations which philosophical ethics will not. And primarily here, of course, I'm thinking of religious authority, or scriptural authority, or religious experience. For a philosopher and for a philosophical ethics class, it's not enough to say that a particular religious authority has endorsed this moral rule, whether it be don't drink alcohol or don't have premarital sex. Nor is it enough to say that we've had a private religious experience and God or some religious deity has told us that we should accept a particular value or do a particular thing or avoid a particular action. For philosophical inquiry, we always want to know what are the reasons, right? What are the reasons? And it is these then that form the foundation of our evaluation. And so it's often the case that people who are involved in religious ethics will have some reasons, some independent reasons, that is, reasons which do not involve purely religious authority or private religious experience, to back up their views. So it's often the case that we might initially have believed something only because of our religious beliefs, but then we can also think of some reasons why people should do this or should avoid this. And so, again, in this class, it may be that a lot of your views initially, or at least some of them, would be primarily justified by religion, and that's fine to voice them, but we always want to know why you believe that, right? And usually it will be some mixture of reasons which involve these sorts of considerations: religious experience, religious authority, and some other reasons as well. And as philosophers, we will be asking you to concentrate on those kinds of reasons. Okay, the last thing which philosophy is not is etiquette. And I running out of board space here, so I won't bother to write that down. But we all have, as products of our culture, various beliefs about what is a proper way to behave in social situations, in all kinds of situations. In America, the proper etiquette for greeting another person is the handshake. Here you can take some of my germs and I'll take yours. In China, it may be a bow or some other form of noting the other person's presence. In France, we might kiss each other on the cheek 2 or 3 times. These are ways of culturally accepted ways of acknowledging the presence of another. They are not themselves moral issues. That is to say, etiquette varies from culture to culture. How we dress, whether we wear hats inside or out, whether we can put our elbows on the table at Thanksgiving dinner, whether we can eat with our hands, or whether we're supposed to use knives and forks and spoons, or some other utensil. These are issues of etiquette, and although they can sometimes be turned into moral issues, they're primarily not philosophical issues in the sense we have outlined here today. So these are some 3 or 4 or 5 areas of inquiry which are not philosophical ethics. And again, I do this primarily to hopefully steer you in the right direction and to improve your understanding of what the course is supposed to be, and also to help you to do some philosophy. That is to start thinking about the reasons why and to compare and contrast them, and to be open to the biggest and hardest questions that you encounter as an ethical being. So this ends our little mini lecture here, and I wish you luck in your ethical inquiry.